Well, we're doing this series, The Search for Happy, because everybody wants to be happy. Amen? Happy is being studied about, written about more than ever before, but we're actually doing this series because God is pro-joy. The Bible actually commands us to be joyful, and it's the evil one that loves human misery. And we're basing this series on the book of Philippians, this little letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. And so, as we saw last week when we kicked this off, the theme of the letter is joy. Paul took joy very, very seriously. So we're grounding this series in this book that talks so much about joy. And today I want to contrast what might be called misery-enhancing life strategies. I'll say that again. Misery-enhancing life strategies, okay, with what Paul actually does in his life with God. And so here we go. We're picking up Paul's words to his friends in Philippi in verse 12. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me." What an extraordinary life of this man, Paul. I mean, his perspective, his joy, his life's impact. So here we go. Okay, 3 misery-enhancing strategies in contrast with what he does. Okay, number 1, if you want to make your life miserable, wait until your circumstances are just right to be happy. Now, if you do that, guess how long you'll wait? Forever. Like forever and ever. Notice a phrase Paul uses in verse 12. He says, "What has happened to me?" I want you to know that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And this is so important. He uses the same phrase again in verse 19. He says, "I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance." In other words, Paul says, my circumstances, okay, my situation, what he calls what has happened to me, he says God will use it to do something special. I know that God is up to something, and so I rejoice. Now, Paul is referring to the fact, as we saw last week, that he's been thrown into a Roman prison. Now, let's be honest. If you were thrown into a Roman prison, it probably wouldn't make you happy. But Paul says, I want you to know how I feel about what has happened to me and how I view my circumstances. You might think I would be discouraged sitting in prison. To the contrary, he says in verse 13, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard that I am actually in chains for Christ. Now, in ancient times, prisoners were often physically chained to their guards. So Paul is chained to soldiers in what he calls the palace guard. Okay, so Caesar's guard. These guys would be like the Secret Service. Okay, they're Caesar's soldiers, Caesar's guys. And Paul can tell them about Jesus all day long, and they can't get away because they're chained to him. Paul's saying, like, wow, this is so cool. I've been trying to figure out how to get the gospel to Rome, like to the palace, to Caesar, to the most influential. Like usually, you have to bribe somebody to do that, but now, like Caesar is actually chaining his guys to me, and they can't get away. And so I'll just say, like, do you want to hear about Jesus? And they can't go anywhere. It's like Paul doesn't think he's their prisoner. He thinks they're his prisoner. You want to hear about Jesus? So Paul says, because of what's happening to me, not only is that the case, not only is the word now getting to Caesar's people, but also I'm facing this with courage and joy because Jesus is here and Jesus is at work as Jesus always is. And because of that, we're told other folks, other brothers and sisters are looking at what's going on and it's getting them all fired up. And they're saying, well, if Paul can live that way, because like joy and courage are contagious, then I can live that way. Paul says, I want you to know how I view what's happening to me. Now, we looked last week at what's called the happiness paradox. That I can never be happy if my ultimate goal is for me to be happy. If I choose to pursue a life of meaning, then often I'll get happy thrown in. But if I choose to simply pursue me being happy, I'll end up with neither meaning nor happy. And now this week, we come to what might be called the happiness illusion. And the happiness illusion is this. I believe that I will be happy if I get whatever circumstance I desire. If the things that happen to me are the things that I want to have happen to me. One of the most reliable findings in all of the happiness research, and there's a whole lot of happiness research, is that people are terrible at predicting what will make them happy. And yet we all do this. Like, if I just had this job, if I just had this salary or this house or this marriage, this car, this body, this lifestyle, if I just had that, then I'd be happy forever. And the problem with all of those things is it's not that they don't make us happy, it's that they just don't make us as happy as we want for as long as we want. People get it. The thing that they've wanted, they get it, and then they're not everlastingly happy, and so they think, well, like I must have wanted the wrong thing, or I'm the only one who feels this way, or there must be something wrong with me. And the truth is, if that's you didn't want the wrong thing. And you're not the only person that feels that way, but there is something wrong with you and me. And this leads to a question that's a really important one. I want us to think about the relationship between happy, which is what so many folks in our day talk about, and joy, which is the word so often used in the Bible. Like, what's the relationship with each other? Well, I think as we know, happy is a feeling. Now, feelings are kind of hard to define, but we all know when we experience them. Like a feeling is an emotion, and generally speaking, it's either something that's pleasant and I'm drawn to it, or it's something that's unpleasant and I don't like it. Now, on the positive side, we have all kinds of feelings. We have feelings like pleasure, delight, curiosity, contentment, serenity. And then on the negative side, there's all kinds of other feelings. There's anger and fear and bitterness, sadness, worry, jealousy. And these feelings are so powerful that they kind of seem to us to be our lives. And often we'll ask people when we greet them, like, how are you feeling today? And it's interesting because we virtually never ask, how are you thinking today? Although that's a very important thing. Now, the word happy actually comes from an old word, an Icelandic word, hap. And it's related to the words happen or happenings or happenstance or haphazard or perhaps. Happy is my feeling when something that I like happens to me. And we live for happy. But it just comes and it goes based on whatever's happening. Paul talks a lot, and it's really important, and I'll do the best I can to unpack this. Paul talks a lot about what he calls the fruit of the Spirit. And some of you know his list: love, joy, peace, and so on. Now, Bible scholar Dallas Willard points out that the fruits of the Spirit are actually not feelings. They're what might be better called conditions. They're the condition of the entire person, okay, of personality. That is, of someone's like settled character. It's their basic life orientation, okay, their condition, and therefore it's stable across all circumstances. For instance, you take love as a fruit of the Spirit. Love is very simply, okay, we'll define it as very simply willing someone else's good. Okay, it's wishing and wanting good things for another person. A person who is in the condition of being a loving person then consistently wills the good of other people. It's just what they do. It's natural. But here's what's kind of interesting, and I think kind of ironic. If I idolize the feeling of being in love, if what I crave is always just the feeling of being loved or the feeling of being in love, it can actually prevent me from doing the hard work that I need to do to then enter into the condition of being pervaded by love. Like becoming someone constantly in touch with being loved by God and able to will the good of other people, whatever the circumstances are that they might create. If I idolize the feeling, I will never actually enter into the condition. Now, Paul says peace is a fruit of the Spirit. Now, peace is the rest of will that results from assurance of how things will turn out. Okay? Peace is when my will isn't under this constant straining or striving because I know in God, okay, I know ultimately in God how things will turn out. That's peace. Now, if I idolize peaceful feelings, and if there ever was a time when that happened, it was in the 70s. Everybody wanted to have a peaceful, easy feeling. Good job, Jeff. You were alive then. But see, if I idolize having a peaceful, easy feeling, then when I don't have that feeling, I'll medicate myself, okay? Or I'll do conflict avoidance. I'll avoid the hard work required to enter into the condition of peace, of being a person who is at peace in God, where the peace of Christ is reigning in my heart, as Paul says. Joy it's not a feeling, it's a condition. Joy is a pervasive sense of well-being, and only God can bring this. Joy isn't even like a choice, it involves choices, but it's a condition into which God wants me to grow. And it flows straight out of, and this is the thing, it flows straight out of my faith in Jesus. Jesus has come and shown us the love of God. He's demonstrated through the cross that God is for us. As Paul says in his letter to the Ephesians, famous line, he says, if God is for us, who can be against us? Okay, if God is for us, who can be against us? No matter what happens, see, God isn't defeated. He's always working on your behalf. He sees, he cares, and he's up to something all the time in your life. He's up to something in the lives of the people that you love. He's up to something in the world. Now, Paul, in chains, in prison, had a pervasive sense of well-being no matter what his circumstances happened to be. And it's so interesting how we think about this. Sometimes, like when we, or how we talk about this, sometimes when we greet each other, we'll ask, like, how are you doing? And occasionally, somebody will say, I'm doing okay. And then they tag on, under the circumstances. I'm doing okay under the circumstances. And this is what's extraordinary with Paul. He found a way somehow to not live under the circumstances. Paul discovered that God is actually above the circumstances. He's over the circumstances. And so somehow Paul learned to live above the circumstances. Therefore, joy wasn't a feeling, it was just the condition of which he found himself. Now, maybe you're here this morning and you find yourself like in some sort of prison these days. You know, maybe you're in your own sort of prison of sorts. Maybe it's a prison called lonely, or a prison called cancer, or a prison called just afraid, or a prison called loss. Something in your life, it's just gone sideways. It could be a relationship, could be your career, could be your health, could be some kind of dream that you've had for a long time and it's just died. Whatever that prison might be. But joy comes from knowing this, that God is with you in your circumstances, that He's working all around you on your behalf. And if you'll let Him, He'll work in you and He will work through you. He'll never stop working because He loves you. Whatever your prison is, you're not alone in it because God is up to something. He's with you and He's up to something. Okay, second misery-enhancing strategy is this. If you want to make your life miserable, compare yourself to other people. Notice what Paul says. He says, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. Now notice, these people who are jealous and comparing themselves, these are not folks that are outside the church. They're in the church. And instead of focusing on their own lives and their own, like, what's God calling me to do and how can I be helpful and how can I serve and how can I honor Christ, they're just thinking, hey, look at Paul. Paul is more successful than I am. His ministry is reaching more people than my ministry is. I will compare what I do to what Paul does, and if I can do better than Paul, then I'll feel better about myself. Actually, if it could just happen that Paul would do worse, I'd feel better about myself. And we all do this kind of thing. Like I compare my marriage to somebody else's. And if theirs seems better or easier or happier than mine, then I'm miserable. Man, they look so happy. Awful. I compare my salary, my house, my career, my kids. Look at their kids. Their kids are so good. Compare my body. You look at her, she's like, bam, and then she's like, bam. My looks, my talent, my popularity, my level of success. And when I envy somebody, not only am I unhappy because of what I'm not getting, this is the dark part of it. I'm unhappy because of what they are getting. I'd be less miserable. Here's the answer to my problem. I would be less miserable if they could just be more miserable. A woman dies. She goes to the gates of heaven and asks St. Peter, how do I get in? Peter says, all you have to do is spell one word correctly. She asks, what's the word? He says, love. And she gets in. A few years later, St. Peter asks if she could watch the gate for him for a few hours. And she does. And much to her surprise, while she's watching the gate, her husband shows up. And she's like, wow, babe, good to see you. How have you been? And he says, well, quite well, actually. You remember that beautiful young nurse who took care of you while you were dying? I married her. And then I won the lottery and sold the little house where you and I lived and bought this great big beautiful house on the lake. And my gorgeous new wife and I were skiing in the Swiss Alps when I had this accident that brought me here. But boy, I am so glad that I made it to heaven. How do I get in? And she says, you just have to spell one word correctly. And he says, what's the word? She says, Czechoslovakia. Now, here's the thing about comparison. You will never see a happy, jealous person. Look right there. That's the look of comparison. Some of you are saying cute. That's wickedness right there. But that's it. Why do we do that to ourselves, right? It's so interesting. Paul talks about two groups of people here. He says, Some people watched his ministry and they said, thank God. They watched Paul's ministry just like, oh, praise Jesus, thank God for what's happening there. Other people watched the exact same thing and they said, why God? Like, why him and not me? Like, why can't I be Paul instead of Paul being Paul? Like, I don't want to be me. I want to be Paul. I want his life. I want his success. And I find this fascinating. One Stanford researcher did a study on comparison, how comparing ourselves to others affects happiness. And the hypothesis going in, which this would make sense to me, the hypothesis going in was that unhappy people compare up. Okay? They look at people that are doing better or have more. Okay? More money, more success, more possessions, more talent, and so on. And they assumed that happy people then compare down. They look at people who have less money, less success, less education, and it makes them feel happy. But what they found is that actually, happy people don't compare at all. They don't compare up. They don't compare down. Instead, what happens is they use deeply held internal values as the yardstick for how they're doing. And then, get this, they take pleasure in other people's successes. And they feel sadness about other people's failures. Letting go of comparison it's a better way to live. And I think, honestly, I think most of us know this. We know this. The trick, of course, is like doing it. And so my question for you is this: who do you compare yourself to? Like, is it somebody at work? Somebody at school? Is it a brother or sister, like one of your good friends? Usually we don't struggle to compare ourselves to people that are like far away, like very in a different spot than us. It's usually people that are really close to us, people that do what we do, people that are in our field or at our gym or in our family or care about whatever it is we care about. See, like if I'm a golfer, I'm probably not going to compare myself to Tiger Woods, but I might compare myself to Brendan Cloyd, or Jeff Satterthwaite, or James Fan, or Joey Bowie. Guys on the tee box with me. We compare ourselves to people that are close to us. When it comes to like working out and being in shape, I'm probably not going to compare my body to Marshawn Lynch. What's funny about that? But I might compare myself with like Joe Blow, the guy working out on the bench next to me. It's usually the people that are really close to us, people we spend a lot of time with. So think about this for a second. Who do you get caught up comparing yourself to? And then I just want you to ask yourself this: what do you actually gain by comparing yourself to that person? Like, do you find that you and your sister are just so much tighter because of it? Do you find yourself being a real team builder at work? Do you find yourself happier? And like, is your life enhanced? Okay, number 3. If you want to make your life miserable, go it alone. Like, do it all by yourself. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Apostle Paul, I think a lot of people think of Paul as like this loner, this brilliant but kind of cranky, prickly, difficult guy. But if you ever read his letters closely, if you ever really read it and look through it, you see a very different picture of Paul painted. I mean, you look at his language just in the first chapter of Philippians alone. Paul says to the people he's writing, he says, I thank my God every time I remember you. He says to them, in all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy. And you think about the emotion, you look at that emotion. He says, it is right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart. And you imagine how they felt as they were reading that letter to the church for the first time. He says, God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. And he calls them brothers and sisters, and he pours his life out for them, and it fills him up with joy. There was another study on longevity that was done. And the researchers for this one Their hypothesis was that the people who lived the longest would be people who had someone to love them and care for them and watch over them. And they were kind of right, but they were slightly wrong. It turns out that those who had someone to care for were actually the ones that lived the longest. Jesus said a long time ago, he said, the Son of Man comes not to be served, but to serve. And see, that's just like life in the kingdom. We're made that way. And here's something else research shows about long-term relationships. And some of you heard this. This is famous stuff. Researchers have discovered a magic ratio of 5 to 1, okay? 5 to 1. Researchers consistently find in any relationship where there's a ratio of about 5 encouraging, hope-filled, positive, like bonding, loving comments for every 1 negative, difficult comment, the relationship is likely to flourish, okay, 5 to 1. There's a researcher and professor who's famous for this. He's actually at the University of Washington. He's well known all over the world. His name is John Gottman. And he's famous for his research on marriage. He and his researchers can actually predict whether or not a marriage will end in divorce with a 90% accuracy rate based on listening to a husband and wife talk to each other for less than 5 minutes. Less than 5 minutes. And here's what they're looking for. Okay, they're looking for the ratio of positive to negative comments. If the ratio is lower than 5 to 1, the relationship, they figure, is probably headed for trouble. Now, in workplaces where there's a team, and they're having about 5 encouraging, hope-filled, positive comments for every 1 difficult comment, they're in optimal performance mode. If it dips significantly below this level, then they're in trouble, and that team doesn't perform as well. The same thing is true in families or in churches. And this is why the writer of Hebrews says, let us encourage each other daily. Every day, he says, make this a habit. And so how are you doing with this these days? Now think about your recent patterns of communication where you go every day. Think about how you talk to your kids, how you talk to your spouse, your friends. You think about how you talk to people at work. What's kind of interesting is it actually can't all be positive. It can't. Actually, there does have to be, for every 5 positive ones, about 1 where the Bible's word for it is what we would call admonition. We need feedback. I mean, we need feedback from each other. We need even negative feedback. We need to challenge each other. We need to be challenged. We need to correct each other. We need to be corrected. And if there's no freedom in a relationship to be able to communicate hard things, then that turns out to not be very healthy either. And again, it just goes back to this 5 to 1. So again, I would say think about the people that matter to you most. Like, how do you talk to your mom or your dad? Your roommate? People that you know you want to go deeper with. What would you say is the ratio for you these days? And then ask yourself, what does that relationship, if you want to go deeper, if you want that relationship to thrive, what does that relationship require? And maybe for you, maybe it's time for some hard truth. I mean, maybe you've known you needed to say something for a long time, but it's hard, and so you've just kind of shied away from it, just shrinked back from it. Maybe it's, your dad or your friend or your spouse, and there's something going on, and you see it, and you know it, but they desperately need you to challenge them. Or maybe for you, it would be just the opposite. You think about the relationship, and maybe there's just like, you look at yourself and you go, oh my goodness, there's all this harshness being exchanged. And you just need to find a whole lot more things to be affirming about. Now, I don't know who or what it might be, but healthy relationships thrive in a 5 to 1. A while back, I heard a saying that just rang deeply true for me. Many of you have probably heard this. The saying is that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And man, I'll tell you what, it rings so true to me because that's what I've seen play out. Relationships, man, they can slow you down. They can slow you down, but they can also carry you. People that learn to go together, from what I've seen, they are the ones that go the farthest. My mom was a fantastic woman. She was witty and outgoing, and she could be kind, and she could be really funny and fun. And she was the sort of person that wherever we went, people liked her immediately. Like we'd be standing in line at the grocery checkout, and she'd start talking to people, and they'd laugh. They're like, "You're hilarious." And I thank God for my mom. She loved me, and she was so positive with me in everything that I did. And I knew she was always in my corner. Like she spared no expense. She spared no expense to give me opportunity after opportunity. And as a single mom, we didn't have a lot. She didn't have a lot. But growing up, I knew I was always her priority. And I'll tell you what, I will forever be grateful. But my mom turned out to be the loneliest person that I have ever known. For whatever reason in her life, when people became difficult for her, she would always just opt out of the relationship. Maybe it was inconvenient, maybe there was conflict that was unpleasant, or maybe they started to tell her things that she didn't want to hear. But whatever it was, she just walked away from relationship after relationship. She did it over and over and over. 4 husbands, countless friends, therapists that challenged her, and even me and Jen and her grandkids. She lived in Everett, and we live in Mukilteo, and we barely ever saw her. And for whatever reason for her, it was just easier for her to do life on her own. Because, see, then there's nobody to disagree with her. There's nobody to challenge her. There's nobody to interrupt her routines. And she was the loneliest person that I have ever known. And she was also the saddest person that I've ever known. And there was an ache in her for something. And she wandered through life and just never seemed to be able to find it. And she passed away very suddenly about 2 years ago. And what broke my heart is that I couldn't locate a single friend of hers. And we thought about, and we talked about, Jen and I did, about doing a memorial service for her. But the truth is, it would have just been me and Jen and our kids. And so we decided it just didn't make sense for us. And, the reality of that, it still stings for me. It's just like, man, because she really could be such a delightful person. But she was the loneliest person I ever knew. Now, a few years ago, I went to a memorial service for a man that I deeply respect. And many of you know and love Eloise. And she is a beautiful woman. Man, you are a beautiful woman. And her husband, Al, was a guy that I came to really admire deeply. And years ago, Al and Eloise invited me over one day for lemonade. And so I went to their little apartment, and we hung out for several hours and just chit-chatted about whatever came up. And all around their apartment, there were these beautiful paintings. And and so I said something. I was like, there's like a theme to them. They were all kind of in the same genre. And I said, boy, those are really, really nice. And Eloise was kind of beaming. She says, yeah, Al painted those. Really? He painted all these paintings? Yeah. He's like, yeah. Painted all the paintings. And I was just like, man, like he was really talented. And I had no idea. And he was an entrepreneur, I found out. He started his own business and was very successful with it and widely respected. And, I wish I'd had the chance to get to know him better before he passed. But his memorial service was extremely powerful to me, and this was several years ago, but it was such a stark contrast, as I think about it, to my mom. Because it was at this really big church, and the church was just like packed. And his family and friends from all over the country had flown out to Seattle just to remember and honor him. And as people shared, and just like person after person shared, they remembered, and you could tell, they remembered a man that they knew well, like somebody that they had laughed with and cried with and done life with, a man that they knew intimately. And what blew my mind was how many like lifetime friends he and Eloise have had. Like, you know, like couple after couple that would come up and share and talk about, well, used to do this when we were teens, and then we did this in our 20s, and then in our 50s we did this, you know. It's just like, what? Like they vacationed together with some of the same people every year, like for decades. Like whatever else was happening in their lives, and they had several kids and life was crazy, but I realized like Al and Eloise, they cherished people. They cherished relationships with people. And as I was sitting there, I thought, now that was a man that really knew what mattered. And I thought something else. I thought, to have friendships that deep for that long, you have to be somebody who knows how to extend and receive grace. Because you make mistakes in relationships. You hurt people, you say stupid stuff, right? And you make the relationship a priority. In order to have, friendships that last that long, you have to make the relationship a priority over whatever it is that's easy, whatever it is that's convenient. You have to walk through some really hard stuff in order to get to the beautiful stuff. And so I sat there listening to people talk about Al, and I thought, God, may you enable me to love like that guy did for however much time I have left. May there someday be at my memorial service this many people that have known me deeply and respect me like this, And I just want to close with this. Relationships are hard. Have you noticed that? They're really hard. Family, they're friends. It's hard. They're inconvenient and it's messy. But I'll tell you this, relationships, they're the best thing going on planet Earth. Like your family, your friends, they really, really matter. And so if you've got something that's going sideways with somebody, you do whatever you have to mend and repair. And you cultivate and you invest, you do it. And as followers of Jesus, we take our cue from him, because no matter how complicated and messy it gets with us, he pursues us relentlessly. Now, Jesus said his father he's like, here's how you can think of him. Think of him like a great shepherd. And he said one time, it's like, even if he has 100 sheep and 99 are there with him and one wanders off, he goes after that one with everything that he's got. Why? Because people matter. Paul would say there's nothing on earth that matters more.